Well, thank you so much, Darcy, and for the Root Center for Advanced Recovery for inviting me to do this Grand Rounds. I was thinking, actually, the first Grand Rounds I did was at the Medical University of South Carolina in 1986. And it was the same topic, sports psychology. So there always seems to be an abiding interest in this field. And we're having this Grand Rounds at a good time with the Olympic Games starting tomorrow. So I'm certainly going to reserve some time at the end. So if folks want to have some questions at the end, feel free to fire away. I always love talking about and hearing about the ideas of people regarding addiction recovery. But of course, my first love is sports psychology. So can I control this from here? There we go. So I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about my background. It was sort of an interesting winding road for me to get involved in sports psychology. But I came to Australia. I came to the United States from Australia in the early 1980s and did my Ph.D. at Rutgers University in clinical psychology. And I was always all Australians, I think, are interested in sport. And I was very interested in sport. I've played tennis my whole life. And I ended up doing my master's and dissertation research on sports psychology. And I was just very fortunate to be hired as the head of the Department of Sports Psychology at the United States Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, Colorado, back in 1986. And I was there for the next 8 years. I was eventually the associate director of the sports science division. It was just a fascinating time to be involved in sports science and sports psychology. And then I left there, founded my own private practice consulting firm. And then in 2001, I became a professor at Western Connecticut State University in Danbury. And I've been there for the last 24 years, including in 2018-19, we got started the MS in Addiction Studies, which is the only master's program of its kind. And I was the graduate coordinator there. Until Mary Murphy, no relation, took over. So had a very varied background. And I've been fortunate to be involved in sports psychology my whole career. These are some of the books that I've edited and written. The Oxford Handbook of Sport and Performance Psychology. I'm actually doing the second edition of that right now. We have 124 authors and 46 chapters. So that's really fun to be involved in. And The Cheers and the Tears was a really interesting book. It was about youth sports and got a tremendous amount of interesting feedback and invitations to work with youth sport programs as a result of that book. And I'll weave a little bit of that into the presentation today. One of my main areas of focus my whole career has been on imagery research, which has probably been my main focus in terms of my research work. And written a number of chapters in various books and done quite a bit of research on that topic. So I thought I'd start off because not everyone knows about sports psychology and what it involves, with a little bit of background on the field. So a lot of people think sports psychology is fairly recent, and it's really not. It goes back to 2 centuries, to some research that was published by Norman Triplett in 1897. And his work was interesting. He was interested whether cyclists, when they're riding alone, ride slower or faster than if they're actually riding with other cyclists and competing with each other. And what he found is that they ride, perhaps not surprisingly, faster when they're actually against somebody. And this effect was called social facilitation. There's actually been some really interesting recent research on this using computer modeling. What the scientists have done is they record a person's own speed when they're on a bike in the lab, and they say, go maximum effort, go as hard as you can for the next 5 minutes. And then they record that, and then they give the athlete a rest period. And then they say, okay, now we're going to project on the screen your recording of your just most recent effort, and you have to keep up with them on like the computer simulation. But what they do, psychologists doing research were always a little tricky. They speed up the recording by 1%. And so the person has to keep up, and they were previously thought they were going max effort. Now they're going 1% more, and they do. the interesting finding is that they can go 1%, and it actually goes up to about 2-3%. They can improve. After that, they can't. But if you think about it, right, most sports, a 1 or 2% improvement can make a huge difference. So that research goes all the way back to Norman Triplett. A very famous figure in our field is Coleman Roberts Griffith. He established the first sports psychology laboratory at the University of Illinois way back in 1925, and published a couple of well-known books on the topic. And he actually left academia in the 1930s and was hired by the Wrigley family of the Chicago Cubs. So he became a sports psychology consultant with the Chicago Cubs, which no doubt explains why the Cubs have won so many World Series over the years. Inside joke there. I hope some folks out there like baseball and caught that. 1966, the 60s were really the era when sports psychology sort of started becoming more widespread. And Bruce Ogilvie, who's pictured here, was one of my mentors. And Thomas Tutko wrote a book, Problem Athletes and How to Handle Them, which was sort of really, I think, the first like clinical sports psychology book ever written. And then the field started to become more organized. Various associations were founded. NASPA was founded in 1967. Journals started getting established. Journal of Sports Psychology in 1979. And very importantly for me, because I've been involved in this group my entire career, in 1985, APA recognized the Division of Exercise and Sports Psychology. It was the 47th division established in APA. And in 2010, it became the Society for Sport Performance and Exercise Psychology. And I'm a past president of that group. I've been their council representative to APA Council, and currently doing a lot of work for them on a couple of different things that I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. Another important group that was founded in the same period was the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, ASP, and they held their first meeting at Jekyll Island in Georgia, which I attended in 1986. They are a group that brings together both the sort of the kinetics, exercise phys, sports science type people with psychologists as well. It's not purely a psychological organization. Sports psychology was recognized as a proficiency by APA in 2001, and that's sort of the first step in having it recognized as a specialty within the field. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. There's been a tremendous growth in psychologists working mainly through counseling centers, often associated with athletic departments, in collegiate sport in the last decade. And the Collegiate Clinical Counseling Sports Psychology Association was founded in 2014, and it brings all those folks together, and they have hundreds of members. And something that I'm working on right now, we established some professional practice guidelines in sports psychology. Been working on that for the last 7 years, and we submitted it this year to APA for approval, and I'll share those guidelines with you at the end. So what do sports psychologists do? Well, there's a lot, and many psychologists specialize in one area. Not all psychologists do all the things that I'm talking about here. But one area that is very important is just working with athletes on performance and using psychological skills to handle the pressure of performance. And it's interesting that, that today we're having our grand rounds, and tomorrow is the start of the Olympic Games in Paris. And I always say, as someone who's been at 4 Olympic Games and lucky enough to be on the floor and in the rink and in the field with folks that are out there competing, the pressure of the Olympic Games is incredible. It really is. It's just nothing like it that I've ever experienced. And so handling that and developing plans ahead of time for handling that is an important part of what sports psychologists do. But also optimizing the psychological and emotional well-being of athletes. So a lot of times I get asked, well, does the mental health of athletes have something to do with performance? And well, of course it does, right? Like I have always said my entire career that when you're working with an athlete, you're not working with an athlete. You're working with a person who specializes in sports, and they have everything else in their career that influences them, from relationships, family, sometimes work pressures and so on. And how can all of those things not sometimes affect them when they're on the field or on the court? A third area that a lot of sports psychologists specialize in is working in sort of team dynamics, working with the entire sports organization. So folks that, for example, work with professional franchises are often involved in this. They work with coaches, athletes, athletic trainers, sports medicine doctors, and so on. And then, of course, there's a lot of research done in sports psychology, understanding the developmental, the social, the cultural issues related to sport participation. And over time, a lot of that research informs our clinical practice and helps us improve the work that we do. So sports psychology is not a Ph.D. specialization. There's still, to this day, even though it's become a much more popular area of specialization for people to work in, there's very, very few Ph.D. doctoral programs in sports psychology. There are a couple. There's one out at the University of Denver. North Texas University has one. But for the most part, most of the folks who work in this field get postdoctoral experience after they finish their clinical or counseling degree. There is a fairly common pathway that a lot of younger folks in the field have pursued, which is to get a master's degree in sports psychology, which is often in a department of exercise science, and then follow that up with a doctoral degree in counseling or clinical psychology. So they sort of marry, they combine both fields. So let me just talk about some of the interventions that sports psychologists do, and then we'll talk about some of the ideas and what the research shows in some of these areas. But here you can see some of the typical interventions that sports psychologists will employ when they're working with an athlete or a team. Areas like goal setting and imagery, concentration, of course, is very important, and stress management, right? And I've already talked about how stressful the Olympics can be. I will say the Olympic trials for many United States athletes, which have been held over the last month or so, can sometimes be even more stressful, because can you imagine training for 8 to 12 years to be an Olympian, in a sport like table tennis or archery or high jump, where, then it's not on TV every weekend and people just really focus in on it at the Olympics. And you come down to the Olympic trials and there's perhaps 5 great athletes and there's only 1 spot or 2 spots for those athletes. So the US Olympic trials are an incredibly stressful experience. When we're counseling athletes, and I will work with athletes myself because I'm trained in both areas with the performance side, and then if mental health issues arise and are relevant, I'll work with them around the mental health issues as well. Some folks specialize in one or the other, so you don't always do both. But we do see some clinical issues, some mental health issues that are more common in sport than they often are in other areas of life. Eating disorders and weight management, for example, are huge in sports. Very relevant for us, appearance and performance enhancing drugs are widespread in sports. And obviously some sports like baseball have been through scandals in that. Cycling is another sport that has struggled with APED use. Grief, depression, loss, suicide, this often becomes, people pay attention to it when a famous athlete commits suicide. And athletes are human beings. They're not supermen, superwomen. They're as vulnerable to all the stresses that affect us as any person is. And motivation, you might think, well, athletes are just at the top of their game physically. They have these wonderful skills in particular sports, but motivation does become an issue for many athletes. I've worked with a lot of athletes who have burned out over the years. Sometimes there's, some reasons for that, overtraining perhaps, or a coaching environment that's not terribly supportive. But motivation is an issue for many athletes. We've seen recently, like sexual identity issues, the problems that trans athletes have faced in sports and some of the hostility and backlash against them. Aggression and violence, just being able to handle that, particularly in some sports where it's sort of condoned on the field or on the ice rink, but it's not obviously away from that environment. So how do you handle some of those emotions that you have in the game versus away from the game? I'd say one almost inevitable event for great athletes is athletic injury, right? We did a study with the US ski team, and we found that the odds of an ACL type injury increased by about 25% every year for your years of participation in alpine skiing. So pretty much after 4 years, it's almost guaranteed that you have a knee injury. And athletes often face long, difficult rehabilitations from those. And, just dealing with some of the things, like just something a lot of athletes face that doesn't get talked about a lot is the loneliness that comes when you're away from the team and you're not on the field, you're not traveling with the team, you're not participating. That can be a very tough period to go through for athletes. And then career transitions. I mean, think about some of the sports. It's sort of strange to think, like gymnastics, right? They often retire at age 20, right? They've already finished their Olympic career at such a young age. So it was a great program I was associated with when I was at the Olympic Training Center called the CAPA, the Career Assistance Program for Athletes. And we would have former Olympians, sometimes gold medalists, come in and talk to the younger athletes about some of the issues they faced after they finished their careers. And I've always emphasized with athletes that I work with that you should start planning for your career transition while you're an active athlete. It doesn't hurt your performance to be thinking about some of the things that you're going to do after you've been, super involved with a sport. And I think it pays off with an athlete being more calm and self-assured if that they know some of those issues have been planned for in advance. And then the final area of interventions is, as I mentioned earlier, sports organizational consulting. Sports psychologists do a lot of team building, usually hand in hand with coaches, and a lot of coaching education. A lot of work I've done over the years is working with youth sport coaches around how to keep the game fun, interesting, and yet help the athletes improve as they go along. Because one of the things, and I've got a couple of participants here in the audience today who've actually been students of mine in my program at Western Connecticut State University. But one of the theories that I think is such a practical theory is the self-determination theory, which suggests that the three major motives for all of us as human beings are competence, autonomy, and a relatedness. And competence is a huge one, and it becomes so important in sports where we all feel better about ourselves. We feel more energized. We feel more alive when we know we're good at something and we're getting better at something. And what a great opportunity and responsibility is for coaches to be able to help young athletes with that and light that fire or keep that fire alive. And it's a very sad thing when coaches put those flames out and have sort of the wrong attitudes and the wrong perspective, make it all about competition and winning and so on, which is really not something that developing athletes, young athletes, need to be worrying about. So I'm not going to address this directly, but I sort of want to throw this out there because I think that we might have some interesting conversations at the end of my formal presentation part of this grand rounds. But one thing that I have thought about recently is, can sports psychology interventions offer us some tips for those of us in the recovery field? I've got a slide up here. One obvious area, exercise, right? Like becoming more healthy, more fit, taking some of that energy and drive for drug use and transferring that over to becoming fit and getting involved in exercise programs and so on. That's obvious. But some of the next few slides, I'm going to be offering some tips on how to handle pressure, how to handle sports competition. And one thing I'd like you to think about is, hey, can some of these things be applied in the work that I do with folks that are in recovery? Because I do think there are certainly some crossovers. So I thought I'd base the bulk of my talk today around the mental skills that athletes use and the ones that separate the sort of athletes that you'll be seeing in the next 2 weeks at the Olympics from the rest of us. And we've studied this with my colleagues Lou Hardy from Bangor in Wales and Pat Thomas from the University of Queensland in Australia. We've developed a very well-known assessment instrument called the Test of Performance Strategies, or the TOPS. And what it does is it measures the actual skills that athletes use both in competition, but also in practice. Because if you think about it, for every hour that you spend in a competitive environment, you probably spend, as an elite athlete, 50 hours, 100 hours in practice. And this is an area that we don't often think about, is how do you manage your practice so that it's most effective and that it really pays off. I've recently taken up golf again after a 30-year hiatus. And, being on the driving range, you can just bang balls off a driving range all day and really not improve your game, because if you're not focused on what skills you're improving and how your practice is helping you, it won't make any difference. So these are the competition mental skills that we have identified in over 30 years of research using the Test of Performance Strategies. These are fundamental skills that all athletes utilize to some extent. Self-talk, right? How that little voice in your head is handled. Emotional control. I've already talked about the stress of Olympic performance. How do athletes handle that? Automaticity. You probably haven't heard that one so much, but it's the whole idea of being so well practiced that when you get into the competitive field, you can sort of turn off your mind to some extent and just let your body take over. And a lot of athletes talk about that. They like to sort of quiet their mind so that when they're, for example, going out on the basketball court, they're not thinking of any mechanics or technical things. They're just reacting to the ebb and the flow of the game. Even in areas like free throw shooting, where you would think like, well, that is mechanical. There are like tips, but most athletes, they don't want to be thinking about any of that when they're actually performing. Goal setting, very obvious one. Imagery, the area that I've worked on, and just a fascinating mental skill. Athletes use imagery in so many creative ways that I've learned from over the years to apply in my own life. And then sort of two contrasting skills. Activation, the ability, sometimes you come out, and you can think of this in your own life, for something really important. And for an athlete, this could be a competition, and you're just flat. It's not there on that particular day. How do you lift yourself up and really get yourself going and keep it going throughout the event? And then sort of the contrast for that, relaxation. Sure, many of us have had the opposite experience, where you go into an event that's very important to you and you're too hyped up, you're amped, and you need to bring it down a few notches and able to keep it under control. And then I've highlighted this one in yellow because this shows up in competition, but not in practice settings. So negative thinking. People don't tend to have negative thinking too much when they're practicing, but in competition, if mistakes start to occur, what athletes can often find is that they snowball. And if you can't let that negative thought go, that's trouble for your performance. So this is a skill, obviously not to think negatively, but to handle negative thinking, to learn how to let it go. And then the other one that we see only in competition is distractibility, being able to handle inevitable distractions, right? There's always something that will happen at an event that is unexpected, whether it's weather conditions or the state of the field or fan behavior or something that's happened in your personal life. So these are the competition mental skills. And then these are the ones that we see in practice. And the first 7 of them are all exactly the same as the skills that we see used in competitive situations. But the last one is attention control. So you don't tend to see the negative thoughts coming in. You don't tend to see the distractibility. But what athletes need to be able to do when they're practicing is, as I said earlier, for example, in golf, you just don't get up in golf and just hit ball after ball after ball and not be attending to what you're doing and being able to focus in a way that you're going to be learning some of the kinesthetics, some of the body feel, some of the things that you need to focus on that will be very useful to you when you're putting it into a competitive situation. That is often built in practice sessions. So we call that skill that we see attention control. So let's talk about these skills, and hopefully I can offer a few tips from some of the 30 plus years that I've worked with athletes in these areas. So self-talk, right? Some athletes are just somewhat negative thinkers. Some athletes are extraordinarily positive people, and I'm sure you can relate to that. Those of you who've played any sort of sports, you know some folks that get down on themselves very quickly, and others that manage to stay upbeat. And I have to say, this was probably the area that got me interested in sports psychology as a young person. As I said, I played competitive tennis my whole life through high school and college, and it just fascinated me that you could see some athletes walk out on the court and they were better physically, but they wouldn't let themselves put their best performance out there. They would lose to an inferior player. And it was often around this. They were too down on themselves, too hard on themselves. And not all of us can be Johnny McEnroe. Johnny McEnroe is somebody I always look back at his career. He would express his displeasure, his upsetness in very negative self-talk terms, but he had an amazing capability to put that behind him almost instantly and then refocus on the game. But not many athletes can do that. So one of the things I talk about with athletes that you sometimes hear this cliche, well, you got to go in with a positive mental attitude, right? You just got to stay positive. And that's not actually true, because a positive mental attitude by itself doesn't really solve the problem of high-level performance. And I always give the sand trap analogy. You see some of the golf analogies that I'll sprinkle in today. So if you're in a bunker, in a sand trap, and you're not very good and you're not very confident at playing out of the sand, because it's a little different shot than other shots in golf. Instead of hitting the ball, you actually have to hit the sand, and then the ball sort of explodes out. You can go in and you can say to yourself, I got this. This is going to be a great shot. I'm going to hit a terrific shot. I'm going to put it right on the green. And if you don't have the skill, it won't happen. You might take 2 or 3 swings just to get out of the bunker. You may swing really hard and hit the ball instead of the sand, and the ball goes 100 feet in the wrong direction. So just having a positive mental attitude in and of itself is not a solution to handling that little voice in your head. Instead, what I work with athletes is using that little voice constructively. So usually, if that negative critic is popping in your brain, like, hey, I'm really scared of this sand shot, it's really telling you something. What it's telling you is, this is an area of your game that you need to improve, right? This is something that you need to focus on. Probably going to have to do that in practice situations, but you are going to need to improve. And how do you do that? With sports, it's through coaching, with feedback, right? And over the years that I worked at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, it was fascinating. I could often sort of predict which athletes I would see as a 13, 14-year-old who would end up on an Olympic team 5 or 6 years later, just by their attitude towards feedback. The athletes that actively sought it out, that wanted to get better, that were like, coach, tell me what I'm doing wrong, right? Tell me the areas I can improve. They turned out to be the athletes who were successful in their careers. And the athletes who were sort of, I'm great, I'm terrific already, look at me, I'm so good, and didn't seek feedback, they often faded away and did not make it to the next level. And as I was thinking about this with today's talk, I was thinking about, self-talk in recovery, right? How important that is, and seeking out the support systems that'll help us with, working with clients in recovery, and having them be able to see, hey, how can I use that sometimes negative voice that I'm having, as I'm dealing with situations, and think about, well, this is an area I need to work on, right? This is something that's causing me problems. Where am I going to get the help from to overcome this? Second area of performance mental management is emotional control. This is Christy Yamaguchi. She was the gold medalist in France in 1992. And I was there at the Olympics when she won the gold medal in Albertville. And what was really interesting about that particular event was in the ladies' long competition. And you often, if you watch the Olympics and you're a figure skating fan, you'll know this. Everybody fell down and had a crash in the long program. There was nobody who had a clean, perfect program. So really the question becomes, what do you do when there's a mistake, right? So one of the things that I work with athletes is you can't suppress your negative emotions when they bubble up. If you've made a mistake, you're going to have that immediate experience of like, oh, you know what, right? And it's okay to respond to that. You don't need to push that aside because that's human nature. However, what you do need to do is move on very quickly and refocus. So I talk about with athletes the 4 R's, right? React, allow that reaction, but then immediately relax, right? And that's a skill in and of itself. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. But how do you do that, right? How do you relax? There are various strategies that you can do, but you're basically trying to get your body to come down from that moment of, oh, hell, what did I just do? And then even in sports that are very fast paced, like figure skating, the athlete has a moment to reflect and think, all right, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing I need to focus on? And then just renew your commitment to that so that you can get back in the flow, right? Get back into the routine, get back into the pattern that you've rehearsed so many times. And I talked about hot buttons on this slide, and every athlete has them. I think if you think about your own, experience, we all have areas that they somehow can get under our skin. And these are areas that really athletes need to work on. And again, as I'm thinking about individuals working with individuals in recovery, we talk about, what are the trigger situations, right? What are the situations that can promote reuse, and thinking about rehearsing for dealing with those ahead of time mentally. Mental rehearsal, as I'll talk about when I talk about imagery, is very, very powerful strategy that actually in research, we find that the same areas of the brain that we use to mentally rehearse are the same areas that are involved in the actual physical skills that we do. So I think this is a great area to work on that has overlap between sports and recovery. All right, I mentioned automaticity earlier, and I have some photos here of athletes like Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, athletes that we admire greatly in the sport of golf. And then I have John Daly on the left. And I could have chosen some actually more unflattering recent photos of John. He's an interesting character, but he did win a couple of majors, but had a very short career and flamed out. And why is it that we admire athletes like Nicklaus and Woods? It's because of consistency, right? They do it over a long period of time, month in and month out, year in and year out. And automaticity is one of the reasons for that. And so and this is really crucial at an event like the Olympic Games, when preparing an athlete in the year ahead of the Olympics, it's really important to develop a plan of attack for how you're going to handle your competitive situation, even down to knowing what time of the day are the first rounds on, when are the semifinals, when are the finals, who you're likely to be drawn against, and then develop your own preparation plan for the mental steps that you'll go through. And this could be like watch good batters in the batter box in baseball. They'll just go through the same little ritual every time before they step up to the plate. Might be tugging the glove, spitting on the ground, using their feet to mark out a spot. Golfers will do the same. Tennis players before a serve. Watch Novak Djokovic before he serves, like the same preparation every single time. And that's really crucial because you want that preparation to pay off when you're in a high pressure situation, when it's so easy to get away from that plan and to start speeding up a little, starting to do things that you don't normally do. Dan Gould, very well-known sports psychologist, and I did a survey after one of the most recent Olympics, and we asked athletes to reflect back on, hey, what were some of the things that you wish had gone better or you wish had been different? And then, of course, what are the things that went well? But when they reflected back on what they wish had happened differently, the most common response from Olympic athletes was, I wish I had stuck to my plan better. I got away from it, because it was the Olympics, because it was the Olympic Village, because it was unusual. I didn't do some of the things that I normally do in preparation. So very, very important. And athletes can rehearse that plan in practice situations, so they can sort of mentally simulate the event that they're going to be in. There's a very famous Olympic gold medalist that won the gold medal at 4 consecutive Olympics. His name was Al Erda, and he was the discus thrower. And I was at a sort of a get-together of former Olympians, and one of his British competitors came up to him and they were chatting, and I was just listening to pick up any ideas. And the British athlete said, I used imagery a lot. And Al said, well, so did I. And he said, yeah, I used to imagine the Olympics, and I would throw out the winning throw, and I'd get the gold medal, and I'd be on the podium, and that would really motivate me. And Al Oda said, really? I never thought about that in my imagery. And the British athlete said, well, what did you imagine? He said, well, I'd imagine something like, we got out there and it was raining, and everybody was complaining about the discus was slippery, and I had to refocus and bear down. And I rehearsed that in my mind. Or I'd imagine like I was coming down to the last round and somebody just suddenly threw the world record ahead of me. And now to win a gold medal, I was going to have to beat the world record. And I just had to rehearse. How do you lock in and just ignore that and just go out and throw my best throw? And I was thinking like, wow, this is a gentleman who rehearsed some of the very negative things that could happen, but was prepared for them, right? Because it was part of his plan, part of his training, part of his practice. So really one of the hard things is to stick to your plan under pressure. Some of you that are more of my age group, perhaps a little younger, might remember Paul Bear Bryant, the coach of the University of Alabama. This is a quote for him: have a plan for everything. Plan for practice, a plan for the game. I try to have a plan, and I love this part of the quote, and the guts to stick with it, no matter what happens. In other words, not panicking if something is starting to go wrong, but going back to the basics, the fundamentals. Goal setting. I won't perhaps spend too long on this because this is something we talk about a lot in recovery, right? SMART goals is the standard strategy, for working with individuals. But some of the tips that, when I'm working with athletes, focusing on very concrete, specific actions, right? So like instead of, a tennis player, I'm going to improve my first serve percentage from 65% to 70%, right? Get 70% of my first serves in. That really gives you nothing to work on. What are you going to work on? You're going to work on perhaps tempo, better ball toss, club head speed, racket speed through the top of the swing. How are you going to do that? Wrist position, strength exercises and so on. So those are all practical goals that you can set and focus on. And you can have some of those goals like, I want to improve my first serve percentage, but then you need to break it down into these concrete, specific actions to get there. It's a little bit like going on a diet, right? How many of us say, well, I want to lose 10 pounds, right? But if you don't specifically plan for, I'm going to walk, X number of hours a day. I'm going to hit the gym. I'm going to do it on Tuesdays. I'm going to do it on Fridays. Here's who I'm doing it with. You have to really be focused on the specifics. Daily and weekly goals as stepping stones for long-term goals. Again, elite athletes are wonderful, and their coaches help them with this. They go through a whole season and they have plans for where am I going to be at the end of the season, what am I going to be doing at the midpoint of the season, and how am I going to get there. In SMART goals, the A stands for achievable, meaning goals that you can actually accomplish. But one of the things I think with athletes is also setting challenging goals, right? Goals maybe that are a little bit out of reach. Going back to that experiment where the psychologist made the cycling speed 1% higher for the athletes to try and match. That's what you have to do to achieve great high-level performance, is just keep pushing yourself that little bit more all the time. Being positive, right? We never want to have goals like, I don't want to, or I want to avoid, right? We want to have goals that this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to achieve. And then really important is getting regular feedback. And so that whether, some of it is self-monitoring, you're keeping track of your goals yourself, or you're finding folks, athletes, it's the coach usually, although nowadays, my goodness, some of the things in technology that athletes are doing sort of blows my mind at the moment. They have wearable instrumentation that can give them feedback within 10 minutes of getting off the practice field, videotape, and now 3D AI visualization of their performance and so on. It's really getting to be quite amazing, some of the skills that athletes and some of the technology that they're employing. One thing I can share that you might not have heard about so much regarding goal setting is some of the research that we've done on what we call goal orientation. And it turns out that there's two main types of ways that athletes approach setting goals. We call them task and ego. The names themselves are not that important, but a task involvement orientation is very different from an ego involvement orientation when it comes down to goal setting. So athletes that are task involved, they self-reference the steps that they're trying to achieve, right? Everything is about what am I trying to do, my personal best, how am I going to improve, getting feedback on that. And so it's very much about mastery of skills, getting better so that they feel they're more in control, they're better at what they're doing. And of course, what they want to see is continual improvement. By the way, that's one of the areas that can lead to burnout. And it happens fairly frequently. This is sometimes athletes will hit sort of a plateau and they don't improve for a while. And there can be very good reasons for that, physiological, time, and so on. So helping an athlete, get through that plateau period so they can start moving up again is important. And athletes feel most self-confident if they have this task involvement orientation, if they know that they've exerted a lot of effort, they've done their best, and if they see that improvement. Contrasting that, we find quite a number of athletes, interestingly, that have this ego involvement orientation, which means basically they're all about winning, right? They're happiest when they feel like comparing themselves to others, they're the best. And it turns out that that has some problems associated with it because it tends to undermine motivation. What if you don't win? I mean, none of us win all the time, right? Jack Nicklaus, who I referred to earlier, holds the PGA Tour record for most runner-up finishes. But that was because he put himself in a position, right, so often to be there at the end. And it can also lead to a phenomenon that I call, or other sports psychologists call tanking, where an athlete sort of, to demonstrate that they're better than other athletes, they feel like if they're not showing as much effort, if they're just doing it sort of casually, that just shows how good they are. And you can sometimes see athletes make really terrible mistakes when they do that. And that comes from that ego involvement orientation. So that's something that develops through childhood. It develops through youth sports. It develops through coaching. It can be a little bit difficult to change, But what I work with a lot with athletes who come in with a very strong ego involvement orientation is I don't try and stop that. I try to bring up the task focus so that they start to learn more of the skills about self-referenced improvement, how they can take more control of their own personal improvement. Imagery, I tell you, I could talk about this for hours, but athletes use their imaginations in support of their goals in so many ways. Rehearsal, right? Watch the springboard, the divers in the Olympics this next couple of weeks. They go up there and they pause on the springboard, and you can see them. They're going through their dive. They go through every step of it. The steps out, how many steps, the bounce, the spins, the tuck, the entry. And only then do they open their eyes and they'll go forward and try and hit that exact thing that they just rehearsed in their minds. It helps with confidence, obviously. I always remember one of the very first athletes I ever worked with at the Olympic Training Center. I got there, by the way, this was in 1986. So sports psychology, I don't think was like really very well accepted by athletes in those days. And one of the brave athletes who ventured in to see the shrink was a table tennis player. And he had had a problem beating this one particular opponent, just couldn't seem to do it. And we worked on him in imagery, hitting the shots that he needed to hit and so on, but actually seeing himself win against this opponent. So it was sort of locked into his mind that he could actually do it. And lo and behold, I don't really think it had that much perhaps to do with me. I think he was almost ready to do it, but he won against this opponent in his very next competition. And suddenly, the next week at the Olympic Training Center, I had like 20 athletes lined up outside my door to make an appointment. So obviously the athletes had all been talking to each other at the training center. So I managed finally to get my foot in the door. Motivation, right? Like a lot of athletes use imagery to sustain themselves during long, boring periods of practice. You know, this is what I'm working for. Can I imagine that being at the Olympics? You know, this is something that is really going to motivate me. And then one I think that we can all use is using imagery for problem solving. And I have a photo here of one of the sports that I really have loved working with the most over the years, which are the canoe kayak athletes. See if you can watch them on Peacock if you can get a chance. But what they do with the canoe race or the kayak race that you see here is that they set this course on this rough rapids river that's very turbulent, a lot of white water, and the athletes are not allowed to practice on the course the day of the competition. So they hang these poles down, and as you can see, the athlete has to just get between them. And if you touch the pole, it's immediately, I think, something like a 15-second penalty, maybe 10 seconds. And then if you miss the gate, it's like a 45-second penalty. You're out of the competition, or you have to go back around and try and come through the gate again, which again will cost you the competition. So what the athletes do before they get out there is they walk the course and they see where all the gates are. And again, you can see the athletes doing this. They try out different approaches, different strategies. What if I attack the gate this way and then go over there? No, that's not a good angle. Maybe if I come this way, yeah, that's better. And then I'll paddle backwards for a bit. And they use their minds, their imagery, to walk right through the whole course and problem solve their way to the strategy that they're going to use. And they go out and they try and do it when the competition starts. And again, there's just so many ways that we can use our mental imagery to help us with our performance. And I think that's something for everyday life as well that I find very powerful. So activation, right? A lot of different ways that athletes, whoa, what just happened? Darcy, can you help me here? What did I just do?
What are you looking for? We're seeing a slide.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, 2 weightlifters.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so you're seeing psyching up now? Okay, it's back. I don't know what my screen was doing. So a lot of different ways that athletes psych themselves up. Imagery is one way, using images that are very energizing for them. Big one is cue words, right? And often they practice with this. They'll have a particular word or a phrase that they say to themselves. And that's like that's the let's go phrase, the cue word. It can be very personal to them, but they practice that when they do that, bam, that's when they turn it on and really up the energy. Music, of course, is a big one. Very easy nowadays with the earbuds and so on to listen to music. And you might be surprised at some of the different playlists that athletes have. They use a variety of different musical genres, shall we say, for amping themselves up. And then breathing, and I'll get to breathing again in a moment with relaxation. But if you think about your emotional state, breathing is really the only direct method we have of immediately impacting our emotional state, right? Can't say to yourself, oh, lower my heart rate, right? Stop sweating, stomach, calm down. No, none of those things. Breathing is the area. So learning breathing techniques, breathing strategies, learning to recognize your own breathing patterns can be very important. And of course, something that all of us need to work on, but very, very important for athletes because their body is their instrument of performance, right? Not like, well, some athletes, I guess, even like a racing car driver, they are, or a yachtsman, you'll see in the Olympics, they do have an instrument that they're working with, but still, they need to focus on these three areas that I always emphasize: fitness, sleep, and nutrition. And sleep is a challenging one at the Olympics because A, you're jet lagged, right? You're in a different time zone. So everybody goes over there early to try and adjust to that. And B, the Olympic Village can actually be a very noisy place. And so having some strategies for dealing with the constant commotion and excitement and everybody around you being sort of amped up is an important strategy. And then, of course, nutrition, right? What you put into your body is so important in terms, and athletes are very, very careful with their nutrition for the most part. So relaxation is the other strategy. And something that, so, very important to work with, particularly I think with younger athletes or athletes as they're sort of getting into their teen years, is it's okay to be nervous. I think one of the really good things about youth sports is that most athletes are not really nervous because they're just there for having the fun. They're just enjoying the game. They're just getting introduced to it and so on. It's unfortunately as we grow up and that little voice in the brain that I talked about earlier starts to become more and more prevalent, that we can enter a competition and we're like, ooh, really nervous about this. And we're thinking about some of perhaps the bad things that could happen or how important it is to win this particular game. Team's going to make the playoffs if we win today. Everybody's sort of amped up for that. And so something that I think is really important to tell them, and this is based on years and years of research, is it's okay to be nervous. Anxiety levels can often be very high for athletes and they can still perform very well. What you want to avoid is letting it get to that level where you could panic, where it's a tipping point, really. We've found in our research that it happens very suddenly. Athlete can be getting more and more anxious and sort of gradual, but if they get to that tipping point, man, it's like going off a cliff. Performance can really disintegrate. And once that happens, it's very hard to get that back again. So, the main thing I work with on athletes is learn to recognize your own levels and just pull back a little bit if you start getting up towards that cliff, if you start getting towards the tipping point, and having some strategies to do that. The other area, of course, and this is not so much with elite athletes, but you see it a lot with younger athletes, is if they interpret their anxiety as a bad thing and then they avoid the situation, right? So they either avoid the sport or they avoid putting themselves in situations where they might feel anxious. And that's bad because then they're not risk-taking, they're not trying new things, they're not seeing what they're capable of and what their potential is. So as I said earlier, breathing is one of the only direct ways. So there's a number of different breathing strategies that I use with athletes. Often it involves a lot of practice in terms of what your normal level of breathing is, and then learning diaphragmatic breathing, where you take the air deeper down into the lungs. And again, I think these are some strategies that work well for individuals in recovery too, when they're dealing with situations that are very stressful for them, that might, be likely to lead to reuse when they don't want to, and so on. But again, it takes practice, right? These are not things to introduce and then expect an athlete to suddenly be able to do that when they enter the competition. This is something that athletes need to work on, often for years till they're really, really good at it. And it can be done very fast. Like once you become good at learning some of your deep breathings, it can take just a couple of deep cleansing breaths, even as like you're walking up to the green to putt for a golfer, or you're going back to get the balls, for your next serve as a tennis player. You can do some of those deep breathing exercises very quickly and on site. And muscle relaxation, honestly, is another one that doesn't help so much with the general body area, but if you can learn what are some of the key muscles groups that you need to relax. For golfers, for example, it's often the wrists and the forearms. So I'll do like some progressive muscle relaxation type exercises and learn to do them in a very abbreviated version. Sometimes if athletes have some time, like before a game, I don't know how many of you watched the NCAA football championship winning team last year, Michigan. But J.J. McCarthy, the quarterback, would go out on the field an hour before the game would start, and he'd sit down with his back to the goalpost, lean back, put his earbuds on, and when reporters asked him what he was doing, he said, "I'm just going through the game and visualizing what the game plan is." And he would just sit there and do that for 15 minutes on the field, which I thought was a lot of times athletes will do that in the locker room, but he goes out on the field and does it. So visualization is a good way to take some of that, amped up energy and just use it to calm down and focus on what you have to do. And then attention control, right? As I said earlier, attention control is the skill that athletes use in practice. Managing distractibility is where you see it in competition. And so concentration requires mental effort. And what we find is that to really focus on something, you really can't focus on more than one thing at a time. If you have a son or a daughter that, tells you that they're studying and they got the music playing and they got 5 screens, they got the headphones on, they're BSing, right? Because you can't multitask effectively as a human being, right? You have to be able to focus on one thing at a time. And for athletes, what they learn to focus on are the things that are relevant to their performance, right? Like what are the things that are really important and what are under their control. It's no good focusing and worrying about things that are not under your control. The weather's not under your control. The fans are not under your control. Even like how nervous your coach looks on the sidelines, not under your control, right? So you need to be able to focus on the things that lead consistently to good performance. When our colleagues in biomechanics studied tennis players, for example, what they found was that the difference between like the really elite athletes and like the next tier when they're focusing on returning serve was quite interesting. The really, really elites were watching the angle of the wrist of their opponent as it came through the contact point at the top of the serve, because they were able to learn to predict what type of serve their opponent was hitting, going down the line, going out wide and so on, and react just that little bit more quickly. Really good athletes were still focusing on that, but they were focusing on like just the whole arm of the athlete, and this is with, I'm not a biomechanist, but they use all this like visual feedback telemetry that they utilize to do these studies. And I just thought that was so fascinating, just like such a small change in the truly elite athletes. Also, when we're talking about concentration, I have the word flow up there. And this is a really, really important concept. And it applies to all levels of sports. Athletes do better when they're in the flow, meaning what is in the flow? Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the famous psychologist who developed this concept, defined it as when your level of skill matches the level of challenge that you're setting out for yourself, right? So for an elite athlete, obviously, they're very, very skilled. So the challenge has to be very, very high. And if the challenge is not, one of the problems that it can lead to is boredom, right? Conversely, I've played tennis all my life, but if you put me out on center court at Wimbledon and asked me to play a professional player and people were watching, that challenge is way too much for me, right? My skill level is not there, so I would get anxious in that situation. And the interesting thing, as you can see, is that flow moves upwards on this chart, right? So for a less talented or a beginning athlete, that's okay. Their skill level is not there, but they can still experience flow experiences, just like in the zone, in the moment, really enjoying it, not worrying about the past, not worrying about the future, just really enjoying what they're doing if the level of challenge is set at their skill level. And again, that goes all the way up through levels of expertise. And I was thinking about that too with, working with clients in recovery. Sometimes, you got somebody who's just new to recovery. And I think sometimes this is some of the problems we have, with total abstinence, turns some clients off. The challenge, they don't have the skills, right, to become totally abstinent immediately. And the challenge is just like huge for them. And it leads to failure, it leads to anxiety. On the same token, if you go up, we've all had clients, it's their 5th time in an IOP program, they're hearing things over and over again that they've heard 7 times before. Maybe sometimes something will get through new and it'll hit the spot, that's great. But also we have to be careful there that boredom, right? That they're not challenged. They're not really trying anything new or different than just the way they've attacked things before in the past. I don't know. Again, I'd be interested to hear from folks who have more experience in those areas. But it occurred to me as I was thinking about flow, there's some overlap there. All right, I want to leave a good 20 minutes or so for question and answer. So I thought I'd just end up with talking very briefly about some professional practice issues in sports psychology. As I said, jobs have really increased dramatically, particularly in college and pro sports in the last 15 years, which is very gratifying. But it's led to some problems, right? Like, can any psychologist call themselves a sports psychologist? Frankly, what I'm hearing from most of my colleagues in universities around the country is there's just not enough well-trained people to hire at the moment. They can't find folks that have the necessary background. And another issue, and this is one that I'm very involved with, is protecting the consumer. What you hear about a sports psychologist, what can you expect? What sort of training should they have, and so on. So as I mentioned earlier, we've developed these professional practice guidelines in sports psychology, and these have been submitted to APA. We're going to get them back with criticism. We're going to do a public hearing and so on. But I thought I'd just share them with you. And might be able to compare them with some of the areas that each of you specialize in. But our 4 areas of professional practice guidelines are competence and knowledge, professional roles in collaborative practice, cultural competence, social justice and advocacy, and then the final area is assessment and intervention. So you can see on these following slides some of the areas that we're suggesting to APA that they put out there as guidelines for any psychologist before they start working with athletes or in sports settings. So you work within your scope of competence. You don't do things that you're not trained to do. If you want to work in this area, you strive to maintain and enhance your knowledge of sports psychology. Sort of, really good common sense, I think. But I think it needs to be said at this particular time in the evolution of the field. Guideline 3, you really work hard to understand the needs of the client and to work effectively within the sport community. And sports is an interesting world to work in. It has its own culture. You really need to get to know it. In the professional roles and collaborative practice area, we strive to be mindful of ethical responsibilities. And honestly, there are some ethical challenges involved in being a sports psychologist. When I work with the client, it's in an office, a regular client, it's in an office that nobody knows about it. I'm working with the team, I'm out on the practice field, there's reporters around, people taking photos, sometimes it makes its way into social media and people are like, well, who's that, Dr. Murphy that you're working with? What are you guys, that's an ethical challenge that just doesn't happen in other areas. Guidelines 5 and 6 is that we strive to represent our role within a sports organization accurately to our colleagues, and also Guideline 6, we strive to understand their roles so that we can work collaboratively with them. Something that I'm really sort of pleased to see is that sports psychology has become a lot more aware of cultural issues in the last decade. And so Guideline 7 is understanding our own biases, our own attitudes, and being aware of how those might impact our consulting and work. But also guideline 8, we strive to understand the very diverse identities and needs of athletes. And as I said earlier, when I work with an athlete, I work with the whole person in a holistic sense. And athletes have very, very many different identities in a relationship, in a family, at a job, as well as their athlete identity. And that's really important to always think about. And then guideline 9, psychologists should actually advocate for the health, well-being of their athletes and social justice. So we should be somebody that, if we're working with a professional sports organization, we're making this something that the organization is aware of, that mental health is really important. And honestly, the greatest allies we have in that are the athletes themselves. And you've seen, I think, in the last, even just the last 5 years, athletes speaking up about their mental health and taking more proactive steps to preserve their mental health than we ever saw before. And then the last 2 guidelines are psychologists use psychometrically appropriate assessments, ones that are normed and standardized for athletes, and that interventions that we do are evidence-based in the field. And just to highlight some of the job growth in sports psychology, this is a much younger version of me. I think I have facial hair here. I was the only sports psychologist for many years at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. This is the sports psychology staff today in 2024. There's over a dozen folks working, not just in Colorado Springs, but at various Olympic training centers all around the country. And something I'm really delighted to see, this is the medical staff that are going to be with the USOC team at Paris. They're there already. Sean McCann, who's a good friend of mine, left 3 weeks ago. But you can see here, Jessica Bartley, Angel Brutus, Julia, about half the medical team are there for mental health. There's psychologists, which is, again, something I was always the only one there in the Olympics that I went to. So it has really changed. And it's not just the Olympics. The NBA has a mental health program. They require all teams to have a full-time licensed mental health professional on staff. The NFL has a director of player wellness. They don't require teams to have their own psychologists. They have some of their own programs, but many of the programs do. Another good friend of mine, Chris Carr, is the sports psychologist for the Green Bay Packers. They have a whole program that's in-house. It's within the facility there in Green Bay. So it's really been wonderful to talk about my passion and interest in sports psychology with you. These are some resources, and I'm happy to share the PDF of these slides with Darcy, so that if anyone wants to contact her and ask for this, you're welcome to do so. These are some of the organizations that have, a lot of them have really good CE and learning materials in our field. And I just thought I'd get used to seeing Phrygia. Phrygia is the mascot of the Olympic Games. And my wife, Anne-Marie, who is here, you won't see so much of Anne-Marie the next 2 weeks, but you will see a lot of Phrygia. And we were lucky enough to be at the International Olympic Museum in Lausanne last month. And so we took a photo with the mascot of the Olympic Games, who'll be there starting tomorrow. So again, thank you, and really happy and interested to chat with you about any questions or thoughts or comments you may have. And Darcy, I'm not quite sure, do you monitor this, or should I just look for raised hands?
I'm looking at the chats coming in. There's a lot of, can you see them, or do you want me to read them to you? Oh, you're on mute.
Let me just scroll through them. So was it recorded?
Yes, it was.
Okay, great.
From Gemma Brown, Madison, if you go down a little bit further, you'll see.
Yeah, podcasts, very interesting. Boy, I could make a little list. I didn't have it on any of these slides and send them to Darcy. But there are some really great podcasts out there. I always think it's funny because I used to listen to podcasts in the late 1990s. I had, one of the early iPods. I guess maybe it's the early 2000s. And they seemed a little old fashioned in those days. But nowadays, everybody seems to use podcasts. But there's some terrific one. There's one on burnout and preventing burnout that an English sports psychologist does that's really funny. And he talks to athletes. There's one that a couple of colleagues of mine, Brandon Harris and Megan, do, again, where they talk to sports psychologists that are in the field and interview them about some of the work they're doing and so on. So, somebody asked about injury. There's certainly some podcasts out there on dealing with injury. So I'll see if I can make a little list and send it to you, Darcy.
Thank you.
Okay, so question here about stigma from
Madison.
Okay. Yeah, you asked, have I noticed any changes? And enormous. Routinely, when I would give coaching education lectures in the 1980s and early 1990s, you'd have a lot of coaches that would just sort of sit there, their arms folded, be like, this is all rubbish. I'm here because I'm forced to, and sort of very unwillingly participate. Yeah, I really haven't had that in the last 20 years. Coaches, if they feel that way, perhaps they're keeping it to themselves. But 90% or more are just really interested in what the research says, interested in what the experience is. The stigma has changed so much. Bruce Ogilvie, who I mentioned, talks about working in the 1960s of basically the professional sports teams like the LA Rams used to have to almost like smuggle him in to the grounds because they were so worried that if anybody found out about it, that they get all this negative feedback about having a shrink working with their team. And as I said, even when I came to the Olympic Training Center in 1986, most coaches and athletes really didn't know that much about sports psychology. They didn't really know what sort of role that I could play in working with them. And that, I'm just pleased to say, has changed so much. Athletes are by and large very aware of their mental health now. You've seen, I think, leaders like Simone Biles, some Michael Phelps talk about it in swimming. Just, many athletes across the diversity of sports have been so upfront about their own mental health struggles. And, what's really interesting with someone like Simone is that she was willing to do something about it and say, hey, I'm taking myself out because I know that what I'm struggling with right now is dangerous, and that is very true of a lot of these elite level sports. You can't really be in a situation where you're not able to focus 100%. Even, a downhill skier, even 95% concentration, that's not enough. You're coming down the hill at 120 miles an hour. And if you go off and crash, the consequences are bad. And every athlete that's participated in a sport like that for a long period of time has seen those bad consequences. I think you saw it too with the Buffalo Bills linebacker that had the cardiac incident right on the field. And what I heard from some NFL colleagues was that the NFL were like getting ready to sort of go back and resume the game, and the players were like, this guy nearly died out there, Hamlin. We're not going back out on the field in that state of mind. And good for them. So I think you've seen a real change in that in the last decade and a half. And no, you don't really see so much pushback anymore from athletes and coaches. Anyone have any sort of follow-up? Listen, there's still stigma around mental health. We won't deny that. And unfortunately, I think with addiction, that's the one area where you have the most stigma to this day. There's a couple of areas like eating disorders, I think, have a lot of stigma around them in sports. That's not one that athletes are usually comfortable talking about, but addiction is a big one. So there's still stigma to overcome, but the awareness, the receptivity has changed vastly.
Okay, you do have a few more. Do you want me to read them to you, Shane, or you got them?
I can scroll here.
Okay.
Yeah, so ideas for continuing education. So two main groups that do a great job with continuing education are Division 47 of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology. They do great CE workshops. And ASP, Association for Applied Sports Psychology, AASP, do a variety of really interesting forward-looking CE workshops. And there are other groups around the country, like there's the Ohio Sports Psychology CE program with gosh, I'm just blanking on his name, but he's been doing his stuff for years. Sari Shepard out in California runs telehealth groups for psychologists that are interested in retraining into this area. And if you're just interested, like just even like attending a conference, I go to the annual APA convention most years. This year it's out in Seattle, so I'm not going next week. But and there's always a variety of really interesting lectures, workshops for younger folks that they do this speed mentoring every year at APA. So there's a lot of different opportunities if you're able to go to a convention. And we have some programs here that are fairly close to us. Springfield College up in Massachusetts has a mental health for sports master's program for counseling in sports. And they have a conference every year that they host and invite some really interesting people to present. So yeah, there's a lot out there, and I'd highly suggest APA and AASP as two primary sources there. Okay, so there's a question. Is it from Buffy? What about working with young athletes, being open to learning these skills, ages 12 to 18? And I've worked with athletes even younger than that. And I think the most important thing is just like developmentally appropriate, right? So the sort of things that I'll work with 12-year-olds and their coaches is very different than I'll work with 18-year-olds and their coaches. And with the younger ones, you need to keep it fun. You need to keep it very interactive, very hands-on. But still, you can be doing exercises that have like good little lessons embedded in them. Even like team building exercises and things like that. With the older adolescents, you can do more. You can do more discussions. You can give them some more responsibility for running the activities themselves, suggesting some of the ways that they can implement it into their own experience. But again, I wrote a book about that, The Cheers and the Tears. It's been out a while now, but I think you can probably still find it on Amazon. And a lot of coaching organizations around the country and even internationally use that book to put together coaching education programs for their sport, because it's a very practical book. It really, chapter by chapter, it says like, here's some of the things that you shouldn't do in coaching education. Thanks for all the good feedback. It's really great to hear. Yeah, so Chris, made the comment that the NCAA has guidelines, and the NCAA, you can go to their website and download. They have now a professionally produced brochure on mental health guidelines for collegiate athletes. It's really good. Has a lot of really good tips. And as Chris says, it's led to many colleges, particularly D1 programs where sports is, such a big thing, having a very direct relationship with campus counseling centers. So the other co-task force chairperson of the professional practice guidelines that's been working with those with me for the last 7 years is Courtney Albertson. And so Courtney works at Northwestern University up there in Chicago, and she's been there for well over a decade. And I think they've hired like 3 full-time psychologists now that work with their athletic department. And so some of the sports psychologists nowadays tend to be like embedded within a program. They'll be assigned directly to work with the football team, with the swim team, with the basketball team. I think I've always thought that is a very good model. If you can afford to do that, not all programs can, of course, but sometimes, psychologists will do it voluntarily, for volunteer work, pro bono and so on. But to have that like particular relationship with a team over a period of time, I quite often get invitations. Hey, we have a state championship game coming up on the weekend. Would you come in and talk to our team? And I always say no. Like, what could I possibly come in and say to your team 5 days before a state championship that would be of any use? I don't know your team. I don't know anything about them. I'm not a motivational speaker. Howie and Chauncey can probably talk to that. I'm more boring than motivational. But when you're working with a team, you want to have a long-term relationship with them. Secondary boarding schools. Okay. Interesting. Who's this? April. Yeah, I mean, that's a challenging one. April's question is that when I was talking about seeing the athlete as a whole person, that some of the elite athletes, athletes that go to boarding schools for particular sports and so on, that everybody seems to see them as like, the future great golfer, the future great tennis player. And, something I hear a lot from parents, can they get a scholarship to go to college in their particular sport? And you're right. I don't think that's healthy. I mean, I always tell parents, like, don't put your eggs in that basket. There's so few athletic scholarships to go around. It's very rare, even for very talented athletes, to get full rides at a university in any sport. And it's not a good investment, right? If these parents are thinking of it as like they're investing in their child, right? Just takes one injury and that investment is gone. And what are you going to do then? So I think honestly, where the tipping point there is with the parents, right? Working with parents around parent education, about helping parents seeing their child holistically, presenting some of the data. We've done some studies with Olympians over the years, and what we find is that underage champions at an early age, like under 10 champions, these are like national champions, state champions, under 12s, under 14s, they never make it to the Olympics. They never do. It's almost like, that's not a good predictor. And in fact, there's some really interesting research. Athletes that did not specialize in one particular sport, but were multi-sport athletes, have a higher percentage of participation in pro sports in the Olympics than athletes who were unidimensional. And I think, again, that's because in the developmental years, there's so many various, different physical skills you need to learn to become a good athlete, that you don't get them all in any one sport. And also, I think it helps with burnout. So I think, parent education, coach education is important too. And the coaches can often work with the parents. I was actually called in for a consult with the school district here in Connecticut, where the parents were so aggressive and derogatory to some of their own kids out on the field as spectators, that the school felt they needed to step in and set up a program where they would stop doing that. For example, like parents getting really upset who had, kids who were seniors when freshmen would be playing and like taking away their time. I mean, this is like legitimate concerns that this school district had. After I wrote the Cheers and the Tears, which is the subheading is a healthy alternative to the dark side of youth sports, I got invited around the country to do a lot of talks. And it was so funny. Everywhere I would go, they would meet me and they would say, oh, parents, youth sport parents here in Atlanta, they're the worst. they're the worst in the country. Everywhere they would say. Parents here in Chicago, they're the worst. Parents here in Los Angeles, they're the worst. Parents here in, so it's a pretty widespread phenomenon. It's not local. Gina, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome.
I owe you a phone call. I will do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so somebody mentioned LPC programs. So that's a newer area that LPCs that are working in sports environments, social workers that are working in sports environments. I'm not the person to go to. I don't really know anything about those programs, but in chat here, Kristen mentioned University of Texas, University of Colorado, Arkansas, right? Oh, and Jack Lessig was the psychologist whose name I forgot, who does a great job and has been doing it for a very long time. Local universities that have mental health programs through their athletic departments. I would think the main one, usually, as I say, it's the bigger universities. I would think it might be UConn, but I don't know any folks. I should know folks at UConn. My son went there, but I'm not up on all the ins and outs of that program. Someone says SU is Southern is doing a lot of work in this area, which is great. And I do know some of the folks at Southern, and they're a great group. Some good email. My email, okay. It's murphys@wcsu.edu. I actually just retired there, June 1st, but they promised me I can have that email in perpetuity, the benefit of being a professor emeritus, I guess. So just Murphy, my last name, and S, my initial, @wcsu.edu. You'll always be able to get me there. All right, well, I want to keep us on time. We're right at 1:29, and I know this was like a lunchtime, and I really appreciate so many people here and seeing some great familiar faces. It was fantastic. And Darcy, thank you so much for the invitation to come here and chat about this.
Thank you, Shane. This has been wonderful. Very insightful.
And enjoy the Olympics. I'm old-fashioned, I'm a sucker, but I always get tears in my eyes watching the opening ceremonies and everyone coming out. I have like a dual relationship, right? I'm Australian born, but an American citizen. So I get tears for both of those countries when they come out. But it's always really exciting. Let's hope for a great Olympics and a trouble-free Olympics. Okay, thanks everyone.